Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so glad you're here. Look, if you've glanced at the news today, May 16th, 2026, you might be feeling a little overwhelmed. Between military maneuvers and global health emergencies, there is just a massive amount of information flooding our feeds right now. But don't worry, because making sense of it all is exactly what we do here. We're going to take today's 15 disparate global headlines and synthesize them into a single, clear, cohesive narrative to help cut right through the noise.
Here's how we're breaking things down today. We've got four main chapters: geopolitics and military actions, global health and economics, local tragedies and policy, and finally, culture and entertainment.
Okay, let's dive right into Chapter 1, Geopolitics and Military Actions. This is the global chessboard.
We're starting with some high-level diplomacy. U.S. President Donald Trump has been over in Beijing for this very high pageantry trip, but according to the Associated Press, this excursion actually yielded very few concrete economic concessions. And timing is literally everything in geopolitics, because right as President Trump departed China, the Kremlin announced that Russian President Vladimir Putin is scheduling a summit to meet with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. This upcoming meeting is specifically aimed at navigating ongoing global trade blocs and really solidifying regional ties, right on the heels of the U.S. visit.
Now, during his travels, there was one specific remark that really stood out. President Trump referred to U.S. arms sales to Taiwan as a very good negotiating chip in the ongoing trade and diplomatic talks with Beijing. Neutrally speaking here, this specific phrasing has sparked some pretty deep geopolitical anxiety across East Asia today, as all the regional players are trying to analyze exactly what this means for future diplomatic and trade frameworks.
Moving over to the Strait of Hormuz, there's a fascinating new term popping up. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the Iranian regime is rolling out what they're calling maritime insurance policies. But in practice, it functions a lot like a formalized toll system. It effectively forces passing cargo vessels to pay these financial premiums, and in exchange, they get a guarantee that they won't be attacked by Iranian forces. This is a direct, highly calculated attempt by Iran to essentially bypass the ongoing U.S. naval blockade.
Speaking of naval power, take a look at this number: 326. That is the record-breaking number of days the USS Gerald R. Ford, which is the world's largest aircraft carrier, by the way, has been deployed. After 11 straight months of operations spanning the Caribbean and the Middle East, the strike group finally just returned to its home port in Norfolk, Virginia. And to really emphasize the sheer scale and intensity of this 326-day deployment, the unit was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. That's the absolute highest honor a military unit can receive for combat actions.
This brings us to a really rapid succession of military actions across the Middle East and Africa today. Just last night, a White House announcement confirmed a joint precision operation between U.S. and Nigerian forces successfully killed Abu Bilal al-Manuki, who was a prominent Islamic State leader in West Africa. Right around the same time, the Israeli military announced the elimination of a top Hamas commander during localized operations in the Gaza Strip. And, just hours after a really fragile ceasefire extension was reached, Israeli military strikes killed 6 people in southern Lebanon, all while these intensive, closed-door security talks are continuing in Washington, D.C. The sheer pace of these targeted strikes just shows how regional humanitarian initiatives and ceasefire talks are intensely struggling to keep up with the actual military realities on the ground.
All right, shifting gears to Chapter 2, Global Health and Economics. We are looking at some major systemic shocks here. The biggest health news today is, frankly, pretty severe. The World Health Organization has officially declared the ongoing epidemic of Ebola disease in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Uganda a public health emergency of international concern. Spreading cases of this specific virus, it's known as the Bundi-Bugyo strain, have now reached the major cities of Kampala and Kinshasa. And the reason this is causing such a high level of international alarm right now is that there are absolutely no approved vaccines or therapeutics for this specific strain of the virus. And we're seeing a really stark contrast today in how global health crises are unfolding. On one hand, you have that sweeping, uncontrolled Ebola emergency spreading through major African cities. But on the other side of the world, health officials in British Columbia, Canada, are managing their country's first confirmed case of hantavirus. Notice the difference in containment here, though. Canada has placed this single patient in strict isolation amid heightened regional surveillance. It's a swift, highly localized containment effort that stands in really sharp contrast to the multinational emergency we were just talking about. Now, looking at the economic side of things, there are parallel domestic struggles happening right across the Atlantic. In the U.S., President Trump's return from China has him facing some intense domestic scrutiny regarding rising inflation, especially as critics point to a lack of concrete economic relief coming from that trip. Meanwhile, over in the United Kingdom, economic data is revealing a worsening cost of living crisis of a totally different flavor. We're seeing a record number of private renters actually having to resort to public crowdfunding platforms, literally just to cover their basic monthly housing costs and utility bills. These are massive systemic economic shocks felt in very different ways by the citizens of two major powers.
That brings us to Chapter 3, Local Tragedies and Policy. Let's zoom in on the human impact.
We do need to respectfully acknowledge a couple of localized tragedies from today. In a northern Italian town, a driver plowed a vehicle straight into a crowd of pedestrians, leaving at least 8 people injured. Local authorities do have the suspect in custody right now and are actively investigating the motive. Meanwhile, there was a horrific rail crossing collision in Bangkok, Thailand, where a passenger train smashed into a commuter bus. Authorities have confirmed that at least 8 people lost their lives there, with multiple others severely injured.
On the policy front, there's a massive pivot coming out of Singapore today. Their Central Narcotics Bureau has enacted a fundamental change to how they handle rehabilitation. Starting today, first-time drug abusers who voluntarily surrender and ask for help will no longer face mandatory detention at the Central Drug Rehabilitation Center. Instead, they're going to be routed directly into community-based rehabilitation. It's a huge shift in community policy that's really aiming to change the whole trajectory for first-time offenders.
Okay. Let's move on to Chapter 4, Culture and Entertainment. And trust me, we need a breath of fresh air right about now.
I know, after running through those first 15 heavy headlines, you're probably sitting there wondering, was there literally any lighthearted news today? We all need a palate cleanser. Well, thankfully, the answer is yes.
Because today marks a huge milestone, the number 70. It was the 70th Eurovision Song Contest. And in a totally joyous victory, Bulgaria actually claimed the top spot during the grand finale. The winning performance was this incredible collaboration between the artist Dara and the musical act Bangaranga. Just a really bright, much-needed moment of global celebration to cap off what has otherwise been a pretty intense day of news.
So what does this all mean? When we step back and look at these 15 headlines synthesized together, a much bigger picture emerges. In a world actively navigating the Bundibugyo virus emergency, intense economic strains like we're seeing in the UK and the US, and shifting military maneuvers in the Middle East and Asia, how will the systemic shocks we explored today rewrite tomorrow's geopolitical chessboard? The pieces are moving fast, from the Strait of Hormuz to Beijing. I hope this explainer has helped you make sense of the noise, and I'll leave you with that question to ponder as we watch the ripple effects of today's news unfold. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep learning.